Imagine you're standing in a museum, staring at a skull that belonged to someone who lived almost 2 million years ago. The bone is thick, heavy, with a prominent brow ridge that juts out like a cliff face. This isn't your ancestor exactly, but it's close enough that you share fundamental similarities. Same basic body plan, same drive to survive, same capacity to adapt. But here's what will absolutely blow your mind. This species, Homo erectus, didn't just survive for a few thousand years like most human relatives. They dominated the planet for over 2 million years. 2 million years. To put that in perspective, modern humans have only existed for about 300,000 years. We think we're successful, but Homo erectus makes us look like evolutionary newcomers. If you're using these videos to fall asleep, that's totally fine, but maybe hit subscribe first, because did you know? Prehistory is about to take you on a journey through deep time that will change how you think about human success. Someone from Melbourne said they listen at midnight. Someone from Montreal said they tune in at 6 a.m. The math works out, but it still feels surreal that we're all connected across time zones by stories from millions of years ago. This isn't just another tale about ancient humans. This is the story of the most successful human species that ever lived, and nobody talks about them. While we obsess over Neanderthals and debate the origins of modern humans, Homo erectus quietly holds the record for the longest continuous survival of any human species in Earth's history. They were the first humans to leave Africa, the first to master fire, the first to spread across multiple continents. They survived ice ages, volcanic eruptions, and climate shifts that would make modern global warming look like a minor weather pattern. But how do you survive for 2 million years? What kind of evolutionary strategy lets a species thrive through dozens of ice ages, continental drift, and environmental changes so extreme they wiped out countless other species? The answers are hidden in caves across 3 continents, buried in ancient lake beds, and scattered across landscapes that have changed beyond recognition since Homo erectus first walked them. The story begins in Africa, but not the Africa you know today. Picture a continent where the Sahara Desert doesn't exist. Instead, vast grasslands stretch from the Mediterranean to Central Africa, broken by rivers and lakes that have long since vanished. The climate is warmer, more humid, perfect for supporting enormous herds of animals that seem pulled from a fantasy novel. 3-meter-tall giraffes, saber-toothed cats the size of lions, elephant species that dwarf anything alive today. Into this world, around 1.9 million years ago, Homo erectus emerges. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but through the slow grind of evolutionary pressure that shapes all life on Earth. They're taller than their predecessors, with longer legs built for covering vast distances. Their brains are larger, though still only about 2/3 the size of modern human brains. But size isn't everything. What matters is how they use what they have. The first clue to their incredible success lies in their bones. When paleontologists study Homo erectus skeletons, they find something remarkable. These weren't just anatomically advanced humans. They were endurance athletes. Their leg bones show adaptations for long-distance walking and running that put modern marathon runners to shame. Their pelvises are perfectly designed for efficient bipedal locomotion across varied terrain. They were built to move, and move they did. But physical adaptations only tell part of the story. The real secret to Homo erectus' success becomes clear when you examine their archaeological sites. Unlike earlier human species, who left behind scattered stone tools and little else, Homo erectus sites tell a different story. They show evidence of planning, cooperation, and technological innovation on a scale never seen before in human evolution. Take Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, one of the most famous archaeological sites in the world. Here, buried in layers of ancient sediment, researchers have found Homo erectus camps that were occupied repeatedly over thousands of years. not just temporary shelters, but established bases where groups returned season after season. The stone tools found at these sites aren't crude choppers. They're sophisticated implements crafted with techniques that required years of practice to master. The most famous of these tools is the Acheulean hand axe, a teardrop-shaped implement that represents one of humanity's first standardized technologies. For over 1 million years, Homo erectus groups across Africa, Europe, and Asia were making virtually identical hand axes. The consistency is staggering. An axe made in Kenya looks almost exactly like one made in England or Indonesia, despite being separated by thousands of miles and hundreds of thousands of years. This standardization reveals something profound about Homo erectus cognition. They weren't just making tools, they were following complex mental templates, passing down precise manufacturing techniques from generation to generation, with almost no variation. This level of cultural transmission requires advanced cognitive abilities, sophisticated language skills, and social structures capable of maintaining traditions across vast spans of time and space. But tools alone don't explain 2 million years of survival. The real breakthrough comes when we examine what Homo erectus did with fire. Early evidence of controlled fire use appears in Homo erectus sites dating back 1.5 million years, making them potentially the first human species to consistently harness this transformative technology. Fire changed everything. It allowed Homo erectus to cook food, making nutrients more bioavailable and reducing the energy needed for digestion. Cooked meat provided protein-dense calories that fueled their large brains. Cooked tubers and roots became digestible sources of carbohydrates. But fire did more than just improve their diet. Fire extended their day. With controlled flames, Homo erectus groups could remain active after sunset, using the extra hours for tool making, social interaction, and planning. Fire provided protection from predators, turning humans from potential prey into apex predators themselves. Most importantly, fire allowed them to survive in environments that would have been impossible for earlier human species. This thermal adaptation becomes crucial when we consider what Homo erectus did next. Around 1.8 million years ago, they became the first human species to leave Africa. Not in small tentative groups, but in waves of migration that would eventually populate most of the Old World. They spread through the Middle East into Asia, reaching as far as Georgia in the Caucasus, Java in Indonesia, and eventually China. Each new environment presented unique challenges. The seasonal forests of Europe demanded different survival strategies than the tropical islands of Southeast Asia. The high plateaus of Central Asia required adaptations for altitude and extreme temperature variations. Yet Homo erectus thrived in all these environments, establishing populations that persisted for hundreds of thousands of years. Consider Dmanisi in Georgia, where 1.8 million-year-old Homo erectus fossils represent some of the earliest evidence of human presence outside Africa. The individuals found here show something remarkable. Despite being some of the earliest migrants, they had already developed sophisticated social care behaviors. One skeleton shows evidence of dental disease and tooth loss that would have made eating difficult. Yet this individual lived to old age, suggesting the group cared for members who could no longer fully provide for themselves. This pattern of social cooperation appears throughout Homo erectus sites. At Zhoukoudian in China, home to the famous Peking man fossils, researchers found evidence of group hunting strategies targeting large game animals. The bone assemblages show systematic butchering techniques and food-sharing practices that indicate highly organized social structures. But perhaps the most impressive evidence of Homo erectus adaptability comes from their response to environmental challenges that would have destroyed less flexible species. Throughout their 2 million-year reign, they survived at least 20 major ice ages, each one transforming the landscapes they inhabited. Sea levels dropped by hundreds of feet, exposing land bridges between continents. Forests turned to grasslands, rivers changed course, and entire ecosystems shifted. Each climate change event created evolutionary pressure that could have led to extinction. Instead, Homo erectus populations adapted. During ice ages, they modified their tool technologies for hunting different prey animals. When sea levels dropped, they crossed newly exposed land bridges to colonize new territories. When forests disappeared, they developed new strategies for surviving in open grasslands. The key to understanding this adaptability lies in recognizing that Homo erectus wasn't just biologically successful. They were culturally innovative in ways that allowed them to modify their behavior faster than genetic evolution could change their bodies. When environments shifted, they didn't need to wait hundreds of thousands of years for beneficial mutations to spread through the population. They could develop new technologies, new hunting strategies, new social organizations within a few generations. This cultural flexibility shows up clearly in their tool technologies. While the basic Acheulean hand axe remained remarkably consistent, regional variations began appearing over time. Homo erectus groups in different environments started modifying their tools for local conditions. Forest dwellers developed specialized woodworking implements. Coastal populations created tools for processing marine resources. Each innovation spread through local populations and was passed down through generations. The archaeological record reveals wave after wave of technological innovation throughout Homo erectus history. Around 1.4 million years ago, they began creating the first composite tools, combining stone blades with wooden handles using plant-based adhesives. By 1 million years ago, some populations were crafting sophisticated spear points and developing systematic hunting strategies for taking down megafauna. These weren't random technological experiments. They represent systematic problem-solving approaches that allowed Homo erectus to exploit new ecological niches and survive in increasingly challenging environments. Each innovation built on previous knowledge, creating a cumulative cultural evolution that paralleled and eventually surpassed biological evolution in its speed and effectiveness. But innovation alone doesn't guarantee survival for 2 million years. The real secret lies in how Homo erectus balanced innovation with stability. While they continuously adapted their technologies and strategies to meet new challenges, they maintained core cultural traditions that provided social cohesion across vast spans of time and space. The consistency of Acheulean hand axe production across continents and millennia isn't just evidence of advanced cognition. It's proof of cultural systems sophisticated enough to maintain complex traditions while simultaneously allowing for local adaptation and innovation. This balance between stability and flexibility may be the most remarkable achievement in human evolutionary history. The evidence for this remarkable balance becomes even more compelling when you examine what happened to Homo erectus during the Toba supervolcanic eruption, approximately 74,000 years ago. This wasn't just any volcanic event. Toba was the largest volcanic eruption in human history, ejecting so much ash and debris into the atmosphere that it triggered a volcanic winter lasting several years. Temperatures dropped globally, ecosystems collapsed, and many species went extinct. Yet Homo erectus survived, not just in one isolated refuge, but across multiple continents. Populations in Java, China, and possibly Africa weathered this catastrophic event and continued thriving for tens of thousands of years afterward. How do you survive something that nearly ends life on Earth? The answer reveals the true genius of Homo erectus adaptation strategies. They had already been practicing what modern ecologists call bet hedging. Instead of putting all their evolutionary eggs in one basket, Homo erectus had spread across diverse environments, developed flexible technologies, and maintained cultural practices that could be rapidly modified when circumstances demanded it. When Toba erupted, some populations were devastated, but others in different environments with different resource bases survived, and eventually repopulated the empty territories. This dispersal strategy wasn't accidental. Archaeological evidence suggests Homo erectus actively sought out diverse environments, rather than simply following game animals or expanding randomly. Sites in Europe show they deliberately moved into challenging montane environments. Populations in Asia colonized both tropical islands and temperate mainland regions. Each new environment required different survival strategies, but also provided insurance against catastrophic events that might devastate other regions. And if you're finding this story of ancient human resilience as fascinating as I am, maybe consider subscribing to Did You Know Prehistory, because we're just getting started on this journey through deep time, and trust me, the story of how these incredible humans mastered their world gets even more mind-blowing. The sophistication of their environmental adaptation becomes clear when you examine Homo erectus sites from different time periods. Early sites show relatively simple technologies focused on basic survival needs. But as populations established themselves in new environments, their toolkits became increasingly specialized. Groups living near water sources developed fishing technologies. Mountain populations created tools for processing high-altitude plant foods. Coastal groups learned to exploit marine resources. This specialization reveals something crucial about Homo erectus cognition that sets them apart from earlier human species. They weren't just reacting to their environment. They were actively analyzing it, identifying opportunities, and developing targeted technologies to exploit specific resources. This kind of strategic thinking requires advanced cognitive abilities that approach modern human levels in some respects. Consider the Homo erectus site at Gesher Beno Yaakov in Israel, dated to around 790,000 years ago. Here, researchers found evidence of systematic nut processing, including specialized cracking stones and organized spatial arrangements that suggest planned, repetitive activities. The nuts required specific techniques to crack, without damaging the edible portions inside. The archaeological evidence shows these techniques were refined over generations, with knowledge passed down through cultural transmission, rather than genetic inheritance. But the real revelation comes from studying how different Homo erectus populations solved similar problems in different ways. Groups in Africa developed one set of techniques for processing plant foods. Asian populations evolved completely different approaches for handling similar resources. European groups created their own unique solutions. This regional variation in problem-solving approaches demonstrates cognitive flexibility that rivals modern human capabilities. The implications are staggering. Homo erectus wasn't just surviving for 2 million years through luck or genetic superiority. They were actively engineering their own evolutionary success through cultural innovation, strategic thinking, and adaptive flexibility. They were the first human species to realize that survival wasn't just about having the right physical adaptations. It was about having the right mental tools to continuously adapt those physical capabilities to changing circumstances. This cognitive revolution becomes even more apparent when you examine their social behaviors. Early Homo erectus sites show evidence of basic cooperation and food sharing, but later sites reveal increasingly complex social structures that suggest sophisticated communication abilities and organizational skills. At Zhoukoudian, the famous Peking Man site in China, researchers found evidence of organized living spaces with designated areas for different activities. Tool-making zones were separated from food processing areas. Sleeping areas were positioned for maximum protection from wind and weather. Fire hearths were strategically placed to provide heat and light for multiple activity areas simultaneously. This level of spatial organization requires planning abilities that go far beyond simple survival instincts. Someone had to envision how the space would be used, coordinate group activities, and maintain these organizational systems over extended periods. The archaeological evidence suggests these organized camps were used repeatedly over hundreds or even thousands of years, indicating stable social traditions that could be maintained across generations. The social complexity becomes even more impressive when you consider the size of Homo erectus groups. Based on site evidence and comparative analysis with modern hunter-gatherer societies, researchers estimate that Homo erectus lived in groups of 20 to 30 individuals. These weren't just family units. They were complex social networks that required sophisticated communication systems to maintain cohesion. Managing a group of 20 to 30 individuals requires understanding complex social relationships, remembering individual personalities and capabilities, coordinating group activities, and resolving conflicts without destroying group unity. Modern primates struggle with groups larger than 15 to 20 individuals. The fact that Homo erectus could maintain stable groups of 30 or more suggests communication and social management abilities that approach modern human levels. Evidence for these advanced communication abilities appears throughout Homo erectus archaeological sites. The standardization of tool-making techniques across vast geographic and temporal ranges requires precise knowledge transmission. The complex hunting strategies evidenced at sites like Schöningen in Germany, where 400,000-year-old wooden spears show sophisticated craftsmanship, demand coordinated planning and execution. But perhaps the most compelling evidence for advanced Homo erectus cognition comes from their response to resource scarcity. When environments changed and traditional food sources became unavailable, they didn't just migrate to new areas, they innovated. Archaeological sites from periods of environmental stress show increased technological diversity, novel tool designs, and evidence of exploitation of previously unused resources. During the Middle Pleistocene transition, approximately 1.2 million years ago, global climate patterns shifted dramatically. Ice ages became longer and more severe. Many animal species went extinct. Vegetation patterns changed across entire continents. For most species, this period represents a major extinction event. For Homo erectus, it represents a period of unprecedented innovation. Sites from this period show the first evidence of systematic bone tool production, indicating they were exploiting every possible resource from their prey animals. They developed new techniques for processing plant foods that had previously been inedible. Most remarkably, they began creating the first composite tools, combining different materials to create implements more effective than anything that could be made from a single material. This innovative response to environmental stress reveals the secret behind 2 million years of survival. Homo erectus didn't just adapt to their environment. They actively transformed their relationship with it. When circumstances changed, they changed their technologies, their social organizations, their resource exploitation strategies, and their settlement patterns. They were the first human species to realize that survival wasn't about finding the perfect environment. It was about developing the tools and strategies to thrive in whatever environment you found yourself in. The archaeological record shows this adaptive flexibility playing out again and again across different continents and time periods. When ice sheets advanced and forests retreated, Homo erectus populations developed new hunting strategies for open grasslands. When sea levels dropped and new territories became accessible, they rapidly colonized these areas with appropriate technologies already in development. When volcanic eruptions or climate shifts eliminated traditional food sources, they had alternative subsistence strategies ready to implement. This wasn't reactive adaptation. This was proactive preparation for environmental uncertainty. Homo erectus populations maintained diverse toolkits not because they needed all those tools simultaneously, but because they understood that environmental conditions could change rapidly and they needed to be ready for multiple scenarios. The implications extend far beyond archaeology and paleontology. Homo erectus represents the first example in evolutionary history of a species achieving long-term survival through cultural rather than genetic adaptation. They proved that intelligence, flexibility, and cooperation could be more powerful evolutionary strategies than physical specialization or genetic optimization for specific environments. Their success story challenges our assumptions about what makes a species evolutionarily successful. We tend to think of evolution as a process of becoming increasingly specialized for particular environments. But Homo erectus shows that the opposite strategy, becoming increasingly generalized and adaptable, can be even more effective for long-term survival. This generalization strategy required trade-offs. Homo erectus never became as physically specialized as some of their contemporaries. They weren't as robust as Paranthropus species. They didn't develop the specialized dental adaptations of other early humans. Instead, they invested in cognitive flexibility, technological innovation, and social cooperation. These investments paid off with the longest survival record of any human species in evolutionary history. But their success raises an intriguing question. If Homo erectus was so successful, so adaptable, so innovative, why did they eventually disappear? The answer to that question reveals something profound about the nature of evolutionary success and the unpredictable paths that lead from ancient survival strategies to modern human dominance. The disappearance of Homo erectus isn't a simple story of evolutionary failure. It's a complex tale of success breeding its own replacement, of adaptation strategies so effective they eventually gave rise to species that would surpass even their remarkable achievements. Understanding what happened to Homo erectus requires us to look beyond extinction and examine transformation. Around 400,000 years ago, something began changing in Homo erectus populations across Africa and Eurasia. The archaeological record shows subtle but significant shifts in tool technologies, social behaviors, and even physical characteristics. These weren't sudden changes. They were gradual modifications that accumulated over tens of thousands of years, representing the kind of slow evolutionary drift that characterizes successful species adapting to new opportunities. In Africa, some Homo erectus populations began developing larger brain cases and more sophisticated tool technologies. Their hand axes became more refined, showing evidence of advanced planning and aesthetic considerations that went beyond pure functionality. Sites from this period contain tools that seem designed not just for efficiency, but for visual appeal. Symmetrical, carefully crafted implements that suggest their makers were thinking about more than just cutting or scraping. This aesthetic dimension reveals something profound about late Homo erectus cognition. They had moved beyond purely utilitarian thinking into realms of abstract consideration that approach modern human capabilities. When you spend extra time and energy making a tool more beautiful than it needs to be for pure function, you're engaging in symbolic thinking that represents a major cognitive leap. Meanwhile, in Europe and Asia, other Homo erectus populations were following different evolutionary trajectories. European groups developed increasingly robust physical characteristics, adapting to harsh ice age conditions with powerful builds and enlarged nasal passages. Asian populations showed their own unique adaptations, with some groups developing specialized features for high-altitude living, while others evolved characteristics suited for tropical island environments. But the most significant changes were happening at the genetic level, invisible to archaeologists, but crucial for understanding what came next. Molecular studies of ancient DNA from later periods suggest that around 600,000 years ago, Homo erectus populations began experiencing genetic changes that would eventually lead to speciation events. Not extinction, but transformation into new human species, better adapted to specific environmental niches. The process wasn't uniform across all populations. In Africa, some groups evolved into archaic Homo sapiens, the ancestors of modern humans. In Europe, others became the lineage that would eventually produce Neanderthals. In Asia, still others developed into Denisovans and possibly other human species that we're only beginning to understand through genetic analysis. This pattern of speciation from successful ancestral populations is actually common in evolutionary biology. When a species becomes highly successful and spreads across diverse environments, different populations face different selection pressures. Over time, these pressures can lead to genetic divergence and eventually the emergence of new species adapted for specific conditions. Homo erectus was so successful, so widespread, and so adaptable that they essentially evolved themselves out of existence by giving rise to multiple descendant species. Each new human lineage inherited the core adaptive strategies that had made Homo erectus successful, while developing their own specialized improvements for particular environments or challenges. The African descendants retained the behavioral flexibility and technological innovation that had characterized their Homo erectus ancestors. But they pushed these capabilities even further, developing more sophisticated communication systems, more complex social organizations, and more advanced tool technologies. These innovations eventually produced the cognitive and cultural capabilities that we recognize as distinctly modern human. European descendants focused on physical adaptations for extreme cold, developing the robust builds and specialized physiological features that would characterize Neanderthals. But they also inherited the Homo erectus capacity for cultural transmission and technological innovation, creating their own sophisticated tool traditions and social practices adapted for Ice Age survival. Asian populations developed their own unique combinations of physical and cultural adaptations, some of which we're only beginning to understand as genetic analysis reveals the complex history of human evolution in Asia. Each lineage represented a different solution to the challenge of long-term survival in changing environments. But here's where the story becomes truly remarkable. While Homo erectus was transforming into these new human species, they didn't immediately disappear. For hundreds of thousands of years, multiple human lineages coexisted across the Old World. Homo erectus populations persisted alongside their descendant species, occupying different ecological niches and maintaining their own evolutionary trajectories. Archaeological evidence from sites like Ngandong in Java suggests that some Homo erectus populations survived until as recently as 100,000 years ago, long after other human species had emerged and established their own territories. These late surviving populations weren't evolutionary relics struggling to survive in a changing world. They were successful populations maintaining their own adaptive strategies in environments where those strategies remained effective. The final disappearance of Homo erectus seems to have resulted not from evolutionary failure, but from competition with their own descendants. As new human species developed more sophisticated technologies and social organizations, they gradually outcompeted remaining Homo erectus populations for the same resources and territories. Modern humans, in particular, developed technological and social capabilities that gave them significant advantages in most environments. Their more advanced communication abilities allowed for larger, more coordinated social groups. Their enhanced cognitive flexibility permitted faster adaptation to changing conditions. Their sophisticated tool technologies provided greater efficiency in resource extraction and food processing. When modern humans expanded out of Africa around 60,000 years ago, they encountered not just Neanderthals and Denisovans, but possibly some remaining Homo erectus populations as well. The genetic evidence suggests limited interbreeding between different human species, indicating that these encounters weren't always violent. But the demographic and technological advantages of modern humans meant that older populations were gradually absorbed or displaced. The story of Homo erectus disappearance parallels what happened to Neanderthals and Denisovans, but on a much longer timescale. Each of these human species represented successful evolutionary solutions to the challenge of survival in challenging environments. Each had developed sophisticated technologies and social systems that allowed them to thrive for hundreds of thousands of years. But each was eventually outcompeted by descendants who had pushed those same basic strategies even further. If you're fascinated by these stories of ancient human success and transformation, make sure to subscribe to Did You Know Prehistory, because understanding how these different human lineages rose and fell gives us crucial insights into what makes our own species successful and what challenges we might face in the future. The legacy of Homo erectus extends far beyond their direct genetic contribution to later human species. They established the fundamental survival strategies that all subsequent humans would build upon. Their innovations in tool use, fire control, social organization, and environmental adaptation became the foundation for everything that followed in human evolution. Consider the basic survival toolkit that Homo erectus developed over their 2 million-year reign. Systematic tool production techniques that could be taught and maintained across generations. Fire control technologies that extended daily activity periods and expanded dietary options. Social cooperation systems that allowed groups to coordinate complex activities and care for vulnerable members. Environmental adaptation strategies that permitted survival in diverse and changing conditions. Every human species that came after them inherited these fundamental capabilities and built upon them. Neanderthals took the basic Homo erectus toolkit and refined it for Ice Age survival, developing specialized hunting techniques and cold weather adaptations. Denisovans adapted the same basic strategies for high altitude and island environments. Modern humans pushed the technological and social innovations even further, eventually developing agriculture, permanent settlements, and complex civilizations. But the Homo erectus legacy goes deeper than specific technologies or behaviors. They established the basic human pattern of survival through cultural, rather than purely biological adaptation. They proved that intelligence, flexibility, and cooperation could be more effective evolutionary strategies than physical specialization for particular environments. This cultural adaptation strategy became the defining characteristic of all later human species. Instead of evolving different body shapes for different environments, humans learned to modify their behaviors, technologies, and social systems to meet environmental challenges. Instead of waiting hundreds of thousands of years for beneficial genetic mutations to spread through populations, humans could develop new survival strategies within a few generations and transmit them through cultural learning. The speed and effectiveness of this cultural evolution approach explains why human species were able to spread across the globe so rapidly and adapt to such diverse environments. From Arctic tundra to tropical rainforests, from high mountain plateaus to oceanic islands, humans developed appropriate survival strategies not through genetic adaptation, but through behavioral and technological innovation. Homo erectus pioneered this approach and demonstrated its effectiveness over an unprecedented span of time. Their 2 million-year survival record stands as proof that cultural adaptation can provide evolutionary advantages that surpass purely biological strategies for long-term species success. But their story also reveals the dynamic nature of evolutionary success. Strategies that work for millions of years can eventually be superseded by even more effective approaches. Species that dominate their environments for vast periods can be replaced by their own descendants, who push the same basic strategies to new levels of effectiveness. The archaeological record shows this pattern repeating throughout the later stages of human evolution. Each human species represented an improvement on the basic Homo erectus survival strategy, but each was eventually replaced by descendants who developed even more sophisticated versions of the same approach. Modern humans weren't the inevitable endpoint of this process. They were simply the most recent iteration in a series of evolutionary experiments with cultural adaptation strategies. Their current dominance results from having pushed the basic Homo erectus innovations further than any previous human species, not from representing a fundamentally different type of organism. Understanding this continuity helps explain both human strengths and human vulnerabilities. Our capacity for rapid cultural adaptation, our ability to survive in diverse environments, our sophisticated social cooperation abilities, all trace back to innovations first developed by Homo erectus populations nearly 2 million years ago. But our current success doesn't guarantee future survival any more than Homo erectus' success guaranteed their permanent dominance. The same cultural adaptation strategies that allowed them to thrive for 2 million years eventually gave rise to species that replaced them. The same processes that made modern humans successful could potentially produce future human variants with even greater adaptive capabilities. The Homo erectus story suggests that evolutionary success is always temporary, always subject to being superseded by new innovations and adaptations. But it also demonstrates that successful survival strategies can persist and influence evolutionary development for vast spans of time, far longer than individual species exist. Their influence on modern human behavior remains visible today in ways that most people never consider. Our preference for living in groups of 20 to 30 individuals reflects social organization patterns established by Homo erectus populations. Our ability to coordinate complex group activities through verbal communication builds on cognitive capabilities they developed. Our capacity for technological innovation and cultural transmission follows methods they pioneered. Even our responses to environmental challenges echo strategies first developed by Homo erectus. When modern humans face resource scarcity or environmental change, we typically respond by developing new technologies and modifying our behaviors rather than waiting for genetic adaptations. This approach to problem solving represents a direct continuation of the cultural adaptation strategy that Homo erectus used to survive ice ages, volcanic eruptions, and continental-scale environmental changes. The archaeological evidence suggests that this continuity wasn't accidental. Later human species didn't just inherit Homo erectus genes. They inherited Homo erectus cultural traditions, modified and refined over hundreds of thousands of years, but maintaining the same basic approaches to survival challenges. Tool-making techniques, fire control methods, social organization systems, environmental assessment skills, all show clear developmental continuity from Homo erectus through later human species to modern humans. Each generation built upon the innovations of their predecessors while adding their own improvements and adaptations. This cultural continuity explains why human technological development accelerated so dramatically after the emergence of Homo erectus. Once the basic framework for cultural adaptation was established, each subsequent innovation made future innovations easier and more effective. Tool-making techniques became more sophisticated, leading to better tools, which enabled more effective resource extraction, which supported larger populations, which could support more specialized toolmakers, creating a positive feedback loop of technological advancement. Social organization systems followed similar patterns. More effective communication enabled larger groups, which could accomplish more complex tasks, which required better organization, which drove the development of more sophisticated communication, creating another positive feedback loop of social advancement. Environmental adaptation strategies also built upon themselves. Each successful adaptation to new environments provided knowledge and techniques that could be applied to future environmental challenges. Populations that survived ice ages developed cold weather survival skills that could be modified for other harsh conditions. Groups that learned to exploit coastal resources developed techniques that could be adapted for other aquatic environments. This cumulative nature of cultural evolution explains why human species became increasingly successful over time, but it also explains why each species eventually faced competition from their own cultural descendants. The same processes that allowed Homo erectus to outcompete earlier human species eventually produced descendants who outcompeted Homo erectus. The pattern suggests that cultural evolution operates according to its own logic, independent of the biological species that carry it forward. Cultural innovations and social systems develop their own momentum, creating selection pressures that favor individuals and populations best able to participate in and contribute to ongoing cultural development. Human species that failed to keep pace with cultural evolution found themselves at competitive disadvantages, regardless of their other adaptive capabilities. Physical strength, environmental specialization, even superior tool-making abilities couldn't compensate for falling behind in the cultural evolution arms race. Homo erectus succeeded for 2 million years because they pioneered cultural evolution and remained at the forefront of cultural development throughout most of their evolutionary history. They disappeared when other human species developed cultural capabilities that surpassed their own, not because they failed as a species, but because they were eventually overtaken by the very evolutionary processes they had initiated. This perspective on Homo erectus extinction reframes the question from why they failed to why they succeeded for so long. Their 2 million-year survival record becomes even more impressive when viewed as maintaining leadership in cultural evolution for an unprecedented span of time, while facing continuous competitive pressure from their own cultural descendants. The lesson for modern humans is both sobering and inspiring. Our current success results from continuing the cultural evolution trajectory that Homo erectus began nearly 2 million years ago. But that same trajectory suggests that our dominance isn't permanent. We're participating in ongoing evolutionary processes that will eventually produce human variants with capabilities that exceed our own. Whether those future variants emerge through biological evolution, technological augmentation, or entirely new forms of cultural development remains to be seen. But the Homo erectus example suggests that evolutionary success is always temporary and always leads to its own replacement by more advanced versions of the same basic survival strategies. The most remarkable aspect of the Homo erectus legacy may be that they established survival strategies so effective that they're still driving human evolution today. 2 million years after they first left Africa, humans are still using modified versions of their basic approaches to environmental adaptation, technological innovation, and social cooperation. In a very real sense, we are all still living in the world that Homo erectus created. Our cities, technologies, and civilizations represent elaborations on survival strategies they pioneered when the Earth was a very different place. Understanding their story helps us understand our own evolutionary trajectory and the challenges we face as we continue the cultural evolution process they began. The skull in that museum, the one with the thick bones and prominent brow ridges, belongs to a member of the most successful human species in evolutionary history. Not because they survived until today, but because they created the survival strategies that made today possible. Their story isn't just about the past. It's about the ongoing human experiment in cultural evolution that continues to shape our species and our planet. Their legacy becomes even more fascinating when you examine how Homo erectus populations responded to one of the most dramatic environmental challenges in Earth's history. Around 1.2 million years ago, the planet entered what geologists call the mid-Pleistocene revolution, a period when ice age cycles shifted from relatively mild 41,000-year patterns to brutal 100,000-year glacial periods that would reshape entire continents. Most species faced with such dramatic environmental shifts either go extinct or retreat to small refugial areas, where they barely survive until conditions improve. Homo erectus did something completely different. They expanded. During the most severe climate disruptions in human evolutionary history, they spread into new territories, developed new technologies, and actually increased their geographic range. The archaeological evidence for this expansion defies everything we think we know about how species respond to environmental crisis. Sites from this period show Homo erectus populations moving into previously uninhabitable regions as ice sheets advanced and retreated across the northern continents. They weren't just following retreating forests or tracking migrating animal herds. They were actively colonizing landscapes that other species were abandoning. Take the site at Boxgrove in England, dated to around 500,000 years ago. This location was at the very edge of the habitable world during the Middle Pleistocene, a landscape of seasonal extremes that swung between brief summers and 8-month winters. Yet, Homo erectus populations didn't just survive here. They thrived, leaving behind evidence of systematic large game hunting, sophisticated tool production, and organized social activities that suggest they saw this challenging environment not as a last resort, but as an opportunity. The bone assemblages at Boxgrove tell a remarkable story. These weren't desperate survivors, scraping together whatever food they could find. They were selective hunters, targeting the largest, most dangerous prey animals in their environment. Straight-tusked elephants, rhinoceros, massive aurochs that stood 6 feet tall at the shoulder. Taking down animals this size required coordinated group hunting strategies, specialized weapons, and detailed knowledge of animal behavior. But here's what makes it truly extraordinary. The butchery evidence shows they weren't just hunting these massive animals out of necessity. They were processing them with techniques that extracted maximum nutritional value from every part of the carcass. Bone marrow extraction using carefully crafted tools, systematic removal of meat and organs, even processing of hides for possible clothing or shelter construction. This level of resource optimization reveals something profound about Homo erectus' cognitive abilities during this period. They weren't just reacting to environmental challenges. They were analyzing their environment, identifying optimal resource exploitation strategies, and implementing systematic approaches to survival that maximize their chances of success even under extreme conditions. The implications become even more staggering when you consider that similar evidence appears at Homo erectus sites across 3 continents during the same period. In Africa, sites like Olorgesailie show increasingly sophisticated tool technologies and evidence of long-distance raw material transport that suggests extensive trade networks. In Asia, locations like Zhoukoudian reveal complex fire management systems and organized living spaces that indicate advanced social planning abilities. This wasn't random convergent evolution. Homo erectus populations were sharing knowledge across vast distances, maintaining cultural connections that allowed successful innovations to spread through their entire species range. During the most challenging period in their evolutionary history, they were actually becoming more connected, more cooperative, and more technologically sophisticated. The mechanism behind this knowledge sharing reveals another dimension of Homo erectus success that we're only beginning to understand. Genetic analysis of later human populations suggests that Homo erectus maintained surprisingly high levels of gene flow between distant populations throughout most of their evolutionary history. Groups separated by thousands of miles were still exchanging individuals and presumably cultural knowledge on a regular basis. This pattern of maintained connectivity across vast geographic ranges is virtually unknown among other early human species. Neanderthal populations, despite their technological sophistication, show much more genetic isolation between regional groups. Early modern human populations outside Africa also show clear patterns of geographic isolation during their initial spread across the Old World. Homo erectus somehow managed to maintain species-wide cultural and genetic connectivity for over 1 million years while occupying territories that spanned 3 continents. They developed what amounts to a global communication network using Stone Age technology and foot-powered transportation. The organizational abilities required to maintain such a network approach levels of social complexity that we typically associate with much later periods of human development. Evidence for this connectivity shows up in multiple ways throughout the archaeological record. Tool-making techniques that appear in Africa show up in Asian sites within a few thousand years, far faster than could be explained by gradual cultural diffusion. Raw materials from specific quarry sites appear in tools found hundreds of miles away, indicating systematic trade relationships. Even artistic or decorative elements on tools show similar patterns, with design motifs appearing across vast geographic ranges during the same time periods. But perhaps the most compelling evidence comes from their response to the Toba supervolcanic eruption 74,000 years ago. This catastrophic event ejected so much ash and debris into the atmosphere that it triggered a global volcanic winter lasting several years. Temperatures dropped worldwide, ecosystems collapsed, and many species went extinct or suffered severe population bottlenecks. Genetic analysis suggests that modern human populations went through a severe bottleneck during this period, possibly dropping to fewer than 10,000 individuals worldwide. Many other species show similar genetic signatures of near extinction during the Toba event. But Homo erectus populations seem to have weathered this catastrophe with relatively minor disruption. Archaeological sites in Java, one of the regions most directly affected by the Toba eruption, show continuous Homo erectus occupation before, during, and after the volcanic event. Tool technologies remain consistent. Settlement patterns show no major disruptions. Most remarkably, there's evidence that some populations actually expanded their territorial ranges during the post-Toba recovery period. How do you not just survive, but potentially thrive during an event that nearly ended human evolution entirely? The answer reveals the true genius of Homo erectus survival strategies. They had spent nearly 2 million years preparing for exactly this kind of catastrophic environmental disruption. Their dispersal strategy meant that when Toba devastated some regions, populations in other areas could serve as source populations for recolonization. Their technological flexibility meant they could rapidly modify their survival strategies when traditional resources became unavailable. Their social networks meant they could coordinate regional responses and share information about successful adaptations across their entire species range. Most importantly, their cultural tradition of environmental opportunism meant they saw the post-Toba landscape not as a devastated wasteland, but as a collection of new ecological niches waiting to be exploited. While other species were trying to restore pre-eruption ecosystems and behavioral patterns, Homo erectus was innovating new approaches specifically designed for post-eruption conditions. This opportunistic response to catastrophic environmental change may be the most remarkable aspect of their entire evolutionary success story. They didn't just survive disasters. They used disasters as opportunities to expand their capabilities and extend their geographic range. Each environmental crisis became a chance to develop new technologies, explore new territories, and refine their survival strategies. The pattern repeats throughout their archaeological record. Climate shifts that devastated other species triggered periods of innovation and expansion for Homo erectus. Volcanic eruptions that destroyed existing ecosystems provided opportunities for them to colonize new environments. Even ice ages that made vast regions uninhabitable opened up new territories as sea levels dropped and land bridges appeared. If you're starting to see why this species managed to dominate the planet for 2 million years, you're beginning to understand what made them truly special. And if you want to hear more stories about these incredible ancient survivors, make sure you subscribe to Did You Know Prehistory, because we're about to explore how their success strategies influenced every human species that came after them. This disaster opportunism strategy required cognitive abilities that go far beyond simple environmental adaptation. Homo erectus had to be able to assess rapidly changing conditions, identify potential opportunities within apparent catastrophes, and coordinate group responses that took advantage of those opportunities before other species could react. Consider what this meant in practical terms during the Toba aftermath. While ecosystems across Asia were collapsing, Homo erectus populations had to simultaneously maintain their immediate survival while identifying which of the emerging ecological niches offered the best long-term prospects. They had to coordinate information gathering across multiple groups, evaluate the risks and benefits of different territorial expansion strategies, and implement coordinated colonization efforts that position them to take advantage of ecosystem recovery patterns. This level of strategic environmental analysis requires abstract thinking abilities that approach modern human capabilities in some respects. They weren't just reacting to immediate survival needs. They were engaging in long-term planning that anticipated how environmental changes would create future opportunities and positioning themselves to exploit those opportunities when they became available. The archaeological evidence suggests they were remarkably successful at this kind of strategic thinking. Post-Toba sites show evidence of rapid territorial expansion into regions that had been uninhabitable during the volcanic winter, but became prime hunting grounds as ecosystems recovered. Tool technologies from this period show innovations specifically designed for exploiting the new resource combinations that emerged as plant and animal communities reorganized. Even more remarkably, they seem to have anticipated some of these changes. Sites dated to just before the Toba eruption show evidence of resource stockpiling and tool preparation that suggests some populations were already planning for major environmental disruptions. Whether they could predict volcanic eruptions or were simply maintaining disaster preparedness as a standard cultural practice. They were ready when catastrophe struck. This preparedness culture may explain much of their long-term success. While other species devoted most of their energy to optimizing their exploitation of current environmental conditions, Homo erectus maintained what we might call evolutionary insurance policies. They kept diverse toolkits even when only a few tools were needed for current conditions. They maintained knowledge of alternative food sources even when primary resources were abundant. They practiced technologies for harsh conditions even during favorable climate periods. This insurance strategy required significant energy investments that provided no immediate benefits. Maintaining unused technologies, exploring marginal environments, and practicing survival techniques for conditions that might never occur all represent costs that could have been spent on more immediate survival needs. But these investments paid off during crisis periods, when populations with narrower survival strategies went extinct, while Homo erectus thrived. The maintenance of unused capabilities reveals sophisticated cognitive abilities that we typically associate with much later human species. They had to understand abstract concepts like probability and risk assessment. They had to value potential future benefits highly enough to accept present costs. Most remarkably, they had to maintain these strategic perspectives across multiple generations, passing down knowledge and techniques that might not be needed for hundreds or thousands of years. This intergenerational knowledge transmission system represents one of their most impressive achievements. Modern indigenous societies that maintain complex traditional ecological knowledge face constant pressure to abandon traditional practices in favor of more immediately productive activities. The fact that Homo erectus maintained disaster preparedness cultures for hundreds of thousands of years suggests social institutions and cultural values that could resist short-term optimization pressures in favor of long-term survival strategies. Archaeological evidence for these cultural institutions appears throughout their evolutionary history. Sites show consistent patterns of tool caching, where groups buried or stored tools and raw materials in locations that could be accessed during emergency situations. These caches weren't just short-term storage for seasonal activities. Some contain materials that suggest they were maintained for decades or centuries as long-term emergency resources. The spatial distribution of these caches reveals systematic landscape-level planning that covered territories spanning hundreds of square miles. Homo erectus groups weren't just managing resources within their immediate living areas. They were creating regional resource networks that could support survival during extended crisis periods. This kind of landscape-level resource management requires cognitive abilities and social coordination that rival anything seen in later human species. But the most impressive aspect of their preparedness culture may be how they balanced disaster readiness with ongoing innovation. They didn't just maintain static survival strategies unchanged over vast periods. They continuously refined and improved their disaster response capabilities while adapting to changing environmental conditions and technological opportunities. Sites from different time periods show clear technological evolution in their emergency preparedness systems. Early sites show simple resource caches and basic tool stockpiles. Later sites reveal increasingly sophisticated emergency technologies, more complex resource management systems, and evidence of coordinated regional disaster response networks. This continuous improvement in disaster preparedness capabilities suggests they were learning from each crisis they survived. Each environmental challenge provided information that they incorporated into their cultural knowledge systems, making them better prepared for future disasters. Over hundreds of thousands of years, this learning process created disaster response capabilities that were probably unmatched by any other species in Earth's history. The sophistication of their crisis management systems becomes clear when you examine their response to the multiple ice age cycles they survived. Each glacial period presented different challenges depending on which regions were most severely affected, how long the crisis lasted, and what recovery patterns emerged as conditions improved. Yet Homo erectus populations consistently not only survived these events, but used them as opportunities for territorial expansion and technological innovation. During the Ice Age around 900,000 years ago, European populations developed cold weather technologies and social strategies that allowed them to maintain permanent settlements in regions that other species abandoned completely. When conditions improved, they had established territorial claims and resource management systems that positioned them to dominate the post-glacial landscape. The Ice Age at 600,000 years ago triggered similar responses in Asian populations, who developed high-altitude survival technologies and social networks that allowed them to exploit mountain environments that became accessible as lowland regions became uninhabitable. Again, when conditions returned to normal, they had expanded their species range into territories that had never before supported human populations. Each Ice Age cycle added new territories to their species range, rather than simply restoring pre-crisis conditions. Over multiple glacial periods, this pattern of crisis-driven expansion allowed them to occupy virtually every habitable environment in the Old World. They transformed Ice Ages from existential threats into territorial expansion opportunities through systematic disaster preparedness and strategic opportunism. This expansion strategy required not just individual group adaptability, but species-wide coordination that ensured successful innovations could spread throughout their entire range. When European populations developed cold weather technologies, those innovations had to be transmitted to Asian and African groups so they could be ready for future glacial events. When Asian populations discovered high-altitude survival techniques, that knowledge had to become part of the species-wide cultural toolkit. The maintenance of species-wide knowledge-sharing networks over hundreds of thousands of years represents an organizational achievement that challenges our understanding of Stone Age cognitive capabilities. They created what amounts to a global information network using purely cultural transmission methods. Knowledge discovered in one region could spread across 3 continents within a few thousand years, faster than most biological adaptations could spread through genetic inheritance. This cultural information network may have been their greatest evolutionary innovation. It allowed them to function as a single species-wide learning system, rather than a collection of isolated populations adapting independently to local conditions. Each regional population could contribute innovations to the collective knowledge base while benefiting from discoveries made by groups thousands of miles away. The cumulative effect over 2 million years was the development of survival capabilities that far exceeded what any individual population could have achieved through local adaptation alone. They created a species-wide intelligence that could simultaneously adapt to multiple environments, prepare for various disaster scenarios, and maintain technological development across vast geographic and temporal scales. Understanding this species-wide intelligence helps explain how they managed to survive environmental challenges that would have overwhelmed any individual population. When the Toba eruption devastated Asian populations, African and European groups had developed technologies and knowledge that could be rapidly transmitted to support recovery efforts. When ice ages made northern regions uninhabitable, southern populations had maintained cold weather survival techniques that could be quickly implemented when needed. This distributed survival strategy meant they were never completely vulnerable to any single type of environmental disaster. Regional catastrophes that would have caused extinction for more localized species became manageable challenges for a species with global resource networks and knowledge-sharing systems. But maintaining species-wide coordination for 2 million years required more than just effective communication systems. It required cultural values and social institutions that prioritized long-term species survival over short-term individual or group advantages. Populations had to be willing to share their most valuable survival knowledge with distant groups rather than hoarding advantages for themselves. Archaeological evidence suggests they developed cultural mechanisms that encouraged knowledge sharing and discouraged hoarding of survival advantages. Tool-making techniques show remarkably little regional variation, considering their vast geographic range, suggesting strong cultural pressures towards standardization and sharing. Sites containing rare or valuable raw materials show evidence of systematic redistribution to distant populations rather than local accumulation. Even more remarkably, they seem to have maintained these cooperative cultural values throughout their entire evolutionary history. There's no archaeological evidence for the kind of territorial conflicts and resource competition that characterize later human species. Their sites show consistent patterns of resource sharing and technological cooperation across all time periods and geographic regions. This sustained cooperation over 2 million years may be their most remarkable achievement. Modern human societies struggle to maintain international cooperation for decades. The idea of species-wide cooperation lasting for millions of years challenges our basic assumptions about competitive pressures in evolution. Yet somehow, Homo erectus managed to create and maintain cultural systems that balanced individual survival needs with species-wide cooperative strategies for nearly 2 million years. They proved that cooperation could be a more effective long-term evolutionary strategy than competition, even under the extreme survival pressures that shaped early human evolution. Their cooperative approach to survival challenges may explain why they were eventually replaced by more competitive human species rather than simply going extinct. As environmental conditions became less challenging and resources more abundant, the advantages of their extreme cooperation strategies may have been reduced, while the competitive advantages of more aggressive species became more significant. Modern humans, Neanderthals, and other later human species all show more evidence of territorial competition and resource conflicts than appears in Homo erectus archaeological sites. These competitive strategies may have provided advantages in specific circumstances, even though they ultimately proved less sustainable over extremely long time periods. The transition from Homo erectus cooperation to later human competition represents one of the most significant shifts in human evolutionary history. It marks the end of species-wide cooperative survival strategies and the beginning of the more familiar pattern of group competition that has characterized human societies ever since. Understanding this transition helps explain both the remarkable success of Homo erectus and the eventual dominance of modern humans. Extreme cooperation provided unmatched advantages for surviving environmental crises and maintaining species-wide adaptation over vast timescales. But competitive strategies offered advantages for rapid territorial expansion and technological innovation under more stable environmental conditions. The lesson for modern humans may be that different survival strategies are optimal under different conditions. The global environmental challenges we face today might actually favor a return to the kind of species-wide cooperative approaches that made Homo erectus so successful for so long. Their story suggests that our current competitive international systems may be evolutionary relics from a period when local competition was more important than global cooperation for species survival. As we face planetary-scale environmental challenges, we might need to rediscover some of the cooperative strategies that allowed our ancient relatives to survive and thrive for 2 million years. The archaeological record of Homo erectus offers a template for species-wide cooperation that sustained technological innovation, environmental adaptation, and cultural development over unprecedented timescales. Their success demonstrates that cooperation and competition aren't mutually exclusive, but can be balanced in ways that optimize both individual survival and species-level adaptation. Perhaps most importantly, their story shows that evolutionary success isn't just about surviving current conditions, but about developing adaptive capabilities that can handle whatever challenges the future might bring. They created survival strategies so robust and flexible that they continued to influence human evolution long after their own species had been replaced by their cultural descendants. In a very real sense, we are still benefiting from innovations and strategies that Homo erectus developed nearly 2 million years ago. Our capacity for global cooperation, our ability to maintain technological knowledge across generations, our strategies for surviving environmental challenges, all trace back to survival systems they pioneered when the world was fundamentally different than it is today. Their 2 million year survival record stands as proof that with the right combination of cooperation, innovation, and environmental opportunism, a species can not only survive, but thrive through almost any challenge the planet can present. That's a lesson worth remembering as we face our own uncertain evolutionary future. The most remarkable thing about studying Homo erectus isn't just their incredible survival record, it's how they fundamentally changed what it means to be human. When you look at the archaeological evidence spanning nearly 2 million years, you're not just seeing the story of one successful species. You're witnessing the birth of everything that would eventually make modern civilization possible. But here's what really blows your mind when you dig into the details. Homo erectus didn't just survive longer than any other human species. They invented the very concept of human culture as we understand it today. Before them, early human ancestors made simple tools and lived in small groups, but they didn't create lasting traditions that could be passed down unchanged for hundreds of thousands of years. Homo erectus changed all that. They were the first human species to develop what archaeologists call cultural stability. The same tool-making techniques, the same social practices, the same survival strategies persisting across continents and millennia with almost no variation. That level of cultural transmission requires cognitive abilities that approach modern human levels in their sophistication. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to Did You Know Prehistory, because we're about to explore how these ancient innovations laid the foundation for everything from language to agriculture to space exploration. The connections will absolutely astound you. The evidence for this cultural revolution appears in ways that most people never consider. Take their approach to landscape modification. While earlier human species simply adapted to whatever environments they found, Homo erectus began actively changing their surroundings to better suit their needs. They weren't just living in the world, they were reshaping it. Archaeological sites from across their range show systematic evidence of environmental engineering that predates similar activities by other human species by hundreds of thousands of years. They diverted streams to create more reliable water sources near their camps. They used controlled burning to manage vegetation and create better hunting grounds. They even modified cave interiors, creating specialized areas for different activities and improving ventilation systems for their fires. This kind of environmental manipulation requires abstract thinking abilities that go far beyond simple tool use. You have to be able to envision how changes you make today will affect conditions months or years in the future. You need to understand complex cause and effect relationships between your actions and environmental responses. Most importantly, you have to coordinate these long-term projects across multiple individuals and potentially multiple generations. The sophistication of their environmental engineering becomes clear when you examine sites like Terra Amata in France, where 400,000-year-old evidence shows Homo erectus groups returning to the same location, repeatedly over thousands of years, each time making systematic improvements to the site's habitability. They created stone foundations for temporary shelters, established permanent fire hearths with carefully designed ventilation systems, and even built windbreaks positioned to optimize the site's microclimate. But what makes this truly extraordinary is that these weren't desperate survival measures. Archaeological analysis shows these sites were used during favorable seasons when survival pressures were relatively low. Homo erectus was investing time and energy in environmental improvements that wouldn't provide immediate survival benefits. They were planning for future occupations and working to make those future visits more comfortable and productive. This kind of long-term landscape investment requires cognitive abilities that we typically associate with much later periods of human development. They had to understand seasonal patterns well enough to predict when they would return to specific locations. They had to evaluate which improvements would provide the greatest long-term benefits. They had to coordinate group labor for projects that wouldn't yield immediate returns. Most remarkably, they had to maintain these landscape modification traditions across multiple generations. Many of the improvements found at Terra Amata and similar sites would have taken decades or centuries to complete. Individual Homo erectus groups weren't just working on projects for their own benefit. They were contributing to multi-generational construction efforts that would benefit their descendants. This multi-generational project coordination reveals social institutions and cultural values that challenge our basic assumptions about Stone Age cognitive capabilities. They had developed concepts of community property and intergenerational responsibility that allowed them to invest in projects whose benefits wouldn't be realized for decades or centuries. The implications extend far beyond archaeology. These landscape modification practices represent the earliest evidence of humans treating their environment as something that could be systematically improved rather than simply exploited. They were the first human species to develop what we might call environmental stewardship, managing landscapes for long-term productivity rather than short-term extraction. Evidence for this stewardship approach appears throughout their archaeological record. Sites show systematic rotation of hunting areas to prevent overexploitation of game populations. They developed techniques for processing plant foods that didn't damage the root systems, allowing for sustainable harvesting over extended periods. They even created what appear to be managed groves of useful trees near their permanent camps. This sustainable resource management required ecological knowledge that took generations to accumulate. They had to understand animal reproduction cycles, plant growth patterns, and ecosystem relationships well enough to predict how their harvesting activities would affect future resource availability. They needed to develop cultural mechanisms for transmitting this ecological knowledge across generations and enforcing sustainable practices, even when short-term overexploitation might have provided immediate benefits. The maintenance of sustainable practices over hundreds of thousands of years represents one of their most impressive cognitive achievements. Modern industrial societies struggle to maintain environmental sustainability for decades. The idea that Stone Age humans could maintain systematic conservation practices for geological timescales challenges everything we think we know about human-environmental relationships. Yet the archaeological evidence is clear. Homo erectus sites show consistent patterns of sustainable resource use across their entire evolutionary history. There's no evidence for the kind of environmental degradation and resource depletion that characterizes later human species. They somehow managed to support growing populations and expanding territorial ranges without depleting the environments that sustain them. This sustainable approach to resource management may explain much of their long-term success. While other species faced boom and bust cycles as they alternately exploited and depleted their resource bases, Homo erectus maintained steady population levels and territorial ranges that could be sustained indefinitely. Their sustainability strategies become even more impressive when you consider the environmental challenges they faced. During their 2 million year reign, they survived multiple ice ages, major volcanic eruptions, and continental-scale climate shifts that forced other species into extinction or dramatic population crashes. Yet they maintained their sustainable practices throughout all these environmental disruptions. Consider what this meant during ice age cycles. As glaciers advanced and retreated, entire ecosystems shifted across continental ranges. Animal populations migrated thousands of miles. Plant communities disappeared from some regions and established themselves in others. Traditional resource bases became unavailable, while new opportunities emerged in previously uninhabitable areas. Under these conditions, most species either follow their traditional resources into new territories or adapt to exploit whatever resources become available in their current locations. Homo erectus did something far more sophisticated. They maintained their sustainable management practices while systematically adapting them to new environmental conditions and resource combinations. Archaeological sites from glacial periods show modified versions of their traditional sustainability practices adapted for Ice Age conditions. They developed new techniques for managing cold-adapted plant resources. They created sustainable hunting strategies for Ice Age fauna that were completely different from their temperate period prey. They even modified their landscape engineering techniques for permafrost conditions. But they didn't abandon their traditional practices. Instead, they maintained parallel sustainability systems adapted for different environmental conditions. When ice ages ended and temperate conditions returned, they could rapidly shift back to their warm climate resource management techniques without having lost the accumulated knowledge during the intervening cold periods. This maintenance of multiple parallel sustainability systems reveals cognitive abilities that go far beyond simple environmental adaptation. They were maintaining what amounts to multiple complete ecological knowledge systems simultaneously, keeping alive detailed understanding of resource management techniques that might not be needed for thousands of years. The organizational capabilities required to maintain this kind of complex traditional knowledge system approach levels of social sophistication that we associate with much later human societies. They needed educational institutions capable of transmitting detailed ecological knowledge across generations. They required social mechanisms for maintaining unused knowledge systems without losing accuracy over time. Most importantly, they had to develop cultural values that prioritized long-term environmental stewardship over short-term resource exploitation. Evidence for these sophisticated knowledge preservation systems appears throughout their archaeological record. Tool-making techniques show the same kind of precise traditional knowledge maintenance. Complex technologies that were only needed under specific environmental conditions were maintained with remarkable accuracy across hundreds of thousands of years. The precision of this knowledge preservation becomes clear when you examine how quickly they could implement cold weather technologies when ice ages began. Archaeological sites show evidence of sophisticated ice age adaptations appearing within a few thousand years of climate shifts. This rapid implementation was only possible because they had maintained detailed knowledge of these technologies during the warm periods when they weren't needed. The same pattern appears for their warm climate technologies when ice ages ended. They could rapidly shift back to temperate period resource management and landscape modification techniques because they had preserved that knowledge throughout the glacial periods when it wasn't immediately useful. This kind of comprehensive traditional knowledge preservation requires educational and social systems that rival anything seen in later human societies. They had to train specialists in multiple ecological knowledge systems. They needed to maintain detailed oral traditions that could preserve complex technical information across centuries without significant degradation. They required social institutions that valued knowledge preservation highly enough to invest substantial resources in maintaining unused information systems. The sophistication of their knowledge preservation systems explains how they could maintain such complex and effective environmental management practices for nearly 2 million years. Each generation inherited not just the ecological knowledge needed for current conditions, but comprehensive understanding of alternative systems that might be needed if environmental conditions changed. This comprehensive knowledge inheritance meant they were never starting from scratch when environmental conditions shifted. Instead of having to develop new sustainability practices through trial and error during environmental crises, they could immediately implement proven techniques that had been refined over hundreds of thousands of years of previous experience with similar conditions. The competitive advantages of this comprehensive knowledge system become clear when you compare Homo erectus environmental responses to those of later human species. Neanderthals, despite their technological sophistication, show much more limited environmental adaptability. When climate conditions changed, they often faced population bottlenecks and territorial losses because they hadn't maintained alternative resource management systems for different environmental conditions. Early modern humans show similar limitations during their initial expansion from Africa. They succeeded through technological innovation and competitive displacement of other species, but they didn't demonstrate the kind of sustainable environmental management that characterized Homo erectus populations. The contrast becomes even sharper when you examine what happened to environments after Homo erectus populations disappeared. Many regions that had supported sustainable human populations for hundreds of thousands of years under Homo erectus, management showed evidence of environmental degradation and resource depletion after other human species took over. This pattern suggests that Homo erectus had developed environmental management techniques that were more sustainable than anything achieved by their evolutionary successors. Their replacement by other human species may have represented a step backward in terms of environmental sustainability, even though it involved advances in other areas like technology and social organization. The implications for understanding human-environmental relationships are profound. The species that survived longest in human evolutionary history did so not through technological dominance or competitive superiority, but through developing sustainable relationships with their environments that could be maintained indefinitely. Their environmental stewardship practices offer a template for sustainable human-environment relationships that modern societies might learn from. They proved that it's possible to support substantial human populations and maintain technological development while preserving the environmental systems that sustain long-term survival. But their environmental achievements were only part of their remarkable success story. The same cognitive abilities that allowed them to develop sustainable resource management also enabled innovations in social organization that would influence human development for millions of years to come. Their approach to group coordination reveals social institutions that were far more sophisticated than anything seen in earlier human species. Archaeological sites show evidence of specialized role divisions that go beyond simple age and gender-based task allocation. Different individuals seem to have had specialized responsibilities for tool production, environmental management, food processing, and knowledge preservation. This occupational specialization required social coordination mechanisms that could allocate tasks efficiently while maintaining group cohesion and ensuring that specialized knowledge was properly transmitted to the next generation. They had to develop systems for training specialists, evaluating performance, and integrating specialized contributions into effective group survival strategies. The archaeological evidence suggests they achieved this coordination through social institutions that balanced individual specialization with group cooperation. Specialists weren't isolated from general group activities, but remained integrated into community life while contributing their particular expertise to group survival efforts. This integration of specialization with community participation represents a sophisticated solution to one of the fundamental challenges of social organization. How do you gain the benefits of individual expertise without losing the flexibility and cohesion that come from having everyone capable of contributing to general survival needs? Homo erectus seems to have solved this problem by developing what we might call flexible specialization systems. Individuals had specialized expertise, but also maintained general survival skills that allowed them to contribute to any group activity when needed. This approach provided the benefits of expertise while maintaining the resilience that comes from having multiple people capable of handling any survival challenge. The flexibility of their specialization systems becomes clear when you examine how they responded to environmental disruptions. During crisis periods, their specialists could shift from their normal roles to focus on immediate survival needs without losing their specialized knowledge or compromising group effectiveness. This adaptive flexibility in social organization parallels their environmental management strategies and may explain much of their long-term success. Just as they maintained multiple environmental knowledge systems for different conditions, they developed social organization systems that could be rapidly reconfigured to meet changing survival challenges. The sophistication of these adaptive social systems reveals cognitive abilities that approach modern human levels in their complexity. They had to understand abstract concepts of social roles and responsibilities. They needed to develop communication systems sophisticated enough to coordinate complex group activities, involving multiple specialists with different areas of expertise. Most importantly, they had to maintain these complex social systems across generations while adapting them to changing environmental conditions and group needs. This required educational institutions capable of transmitting not just technical knowledge, but also social knowledge about how to organize and coordinate group activities effectively. Evidence for these sophisticated social educational systems appears throughout their archaeological record. The consistency of their social organization patterns across vast geographic ranges suggests standardized approaches to social coordination that were maintained through cultural transmission over hundreds of thousands of years. The transmission of complex social knowledge requires communication abilities that go far beyond simple tool-making instruction or resource location information. They had to develop language capabilities, sophisticated enough to convey abstract concepts about social relationships, group responsibilities, and coordination strategies. The archaeological evidence suggests they achieved this through developing the first systematic approaches to knowledge organization and transmission that would eventually evolve into the educational systems that characterize all later human societies. They were the pioneers of formal education, creating structured approaches to transmitting complex cultural knowledge that made possible all subsequent human cultural development. Their educational innovations may represent their most important contribution to human evolution. Every human society that came after them built upon the educational foundations they established. The very concept of systematic knowledge preservation and transmission that allows human societies to accumulate cultural innovations across generations traces back to educational systems first developed by Homo erectus nearly 2 million years ago. Understanding their educational achievements helps explain how they managed to maintain such sophisticated cultural systems for such extraordinary periods of time. They didn't just stumble upon effective survival strategies and happen to maintain them through lucky circumstances. They deliberately developed systematic approaches to preserving and transmitting their most valuable cultural innovations across generations. This deliberate approach to cultural preservation represents one of the most important cognitive leaps in human evolutionary history. They were the first human species to understand that knowledge could be systematically maintained and improved across generations through structured educational processes. The implications of this cognitive leap extended far beyond their own species' survival. By developing systematic approaches to cultural transmission, they created the foundation for all subsequent human cultural evolution. Every technological innovation, social institution, and environmental adaptation that came after them built upon the educational frameworks they established. In a very real sense, we are still using educational approaches that Homo erectus pioneered nearly 2 million years ago. Our schools, universities, and training programs represent elaborations on the basic cultural transmission strategies they developed when the world was fundamentally different than it is today. Their educational legacy connects us directly to these ancient innovators across an almost incomprehensible span of time. When we teach children how to solve problems, transmit cultural knowledge, or coordinate group activities, we're participating in educational traditions that began with small groups of early humans trying to survive in a challenging and constantly changing world. The continuity of these educational traditions across 2 million years of human evolution represents one of the most remarkable achievements in the history of life on Earth. They created cultural transmission systems so effective and adaptable that they've continued to support human development through every subsequent phase of our evolutionary history. From stone tools to space exploration, from small hunting groups to global civilizations, humans have been building on educational foundations established by Homo erectus when our species was just beginning to understand what it might mean to be truly human. Their story isn't just about the past, it's about understanding the deep evolutionary roots of everything that makes human societies possible today. And if you want to explore more of these deep connections between ancient innovations and modern life, make sure you subscribe to Did You Know Prehistory, because these patterns of continuity across deep time will change how you see everything about human development and our place in the natural world. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of their legacy lies in something that archaeologists are only beginning to understand. Recent discoveries suggest that Homo erectus may have developed the first systematic approaches to what we now call scientific thinking. Not formal science as we know it today, but structured methods for observing natural phenomena, testing ideas about how the world works, and using those observations to improve their survival strategies. Evidence for this proto-scientific thinking appears in their tool-making innovations. Instead of simply copying traditional designs, they systematically experimented with different materials, shapes, and manufacturing techniques. Archaeological sites show clear patterns of technological experimentation, where they tested variations on traditional tools to see which modifications provided better performance. This experimental approach to technology development represents a cognitive leap that goes far beyond simple trial and error learning. They were engaging in systematic hypothesis testing, developing theories about what might work better, and then creating controlled experiments to evaluate those theories. The sophistication of their experimental methods becomes clear when you examine the sequence of innovations in their tool technologies. Each new development built logically on previous experiments, suggesting they were maintaining detailed knowledge about which modifications worked and which didn't. They were essentially conducting multi-generational research programs that systematically explored the possibilities of stone tool technology. But their experimental thinking extended far beyond tool-making. Sites show evidence of systematic experimentation with fire management techniques, food processing methods, and even social organization strategies. They were treating their entire survival system as something that could be systematically studied and improved through careful observation and controlled testing. This systematic approach to survival improvement may explain how they managed to continuously refine their adaptations over such extraordinary time periods. Instead of relying on random innovations or accidental discoveries, they were actively researching better ways to survive and thrive in their environments. The implications of this proto-scientific thinking for understanding human cognitive evolution are staggering. They suggest that the logical reasoning abilities that underlie modern science have much deeper evolutionary roots than anyone previously imagined. The capacity for systematic observation, hypothesis formation, and experimental testing that characterizes modern scientific thinking may have begun developing nearly 2 million years ago. Their scientific legacy connects modern research methods to these ancient innovators in ways that highlight the continuity of human intellectual development across vast spans of time. When modern scientists develop hypotheses, design experiments, and analyze results, they're using refined versions of thinking strategies that Homo erectus pioneered when they were systematically testing improvements to their stone tool designs. Understanding this deep evolutionary history of scientific thinking helps explain why humans seem uniquely capable among Earth's species of systematic investigation of natural phenomena. We inherited cognitive tools for scientific reasoning that were refined over nearly 2 million years of continuous use by our most successful evolutionary ancestors. But the story of Homo erectus scientific thinking is just beginning to be understood. Each new archaeological discovery reveals additional evidence of their systematic approaches to understanding and improving their relationship with the natural world. Their legacy extends from the deepest roots of human scientific thinking to the most advanced technological achievements of modern civilization. They were the original innovators who proved that systematic observation and experimental testing could provide survival advantages that were worth the time and energy investment required to maintain scientific approaches to problem solving. 2 million years later, we're still building on the foundation they established. Every scientific discovery, technological innovation, and systematic investigation of natural phenomena represents a continuation of the research program they began when they first started systematically testing improvements to their stone tools in ancient African landscapes that have long since disappeared. Their scientific legacy may be their most important contribution to human evolution, providing the cognitive foundations that would eventually make possible everything from agriculture to space exploration. They were the first scientists, and we are their intellectual descendants, still using refined versions of the thinking strategies they developed to survive and thrive in an uncertain and constantly changing world. The remarkable thing is that when you trace the development of systematic thinking, from those early Homo erectus experiments to modern scientific methods, you realize we're witnessing an unbroken chain of intellectual development that spans nearly 2 million years. But their innovations in systematic observation and experimental testing were just the beginning of cognitive revolutions that would reshape what it meant to be human. Recent archaeological discoveries have revealed something even more extraordinary about Homo erectus' cognitive abilities. They appear to have developed the first systematic approaches to what we now call predictive modeling, not computer simulations or mathematical equations, but structured mental frameworks for anticipating future environmental conditions and planning responses to scenarios that hadn't yet occurred. Evidence for this predictive thinking appears in their seasonal preparation strategies. Archaeological sites show systematic stockpiling of resources and tools that wouldn't be needed for months or even years. But this wasn't random hoarding. The materials they collected and the tools they prepared show clear patterns that suggest they were making specific predictions about future environmental conditions and resource availability. Take sites in temperate regions where they prepared specialized cold weather equipment during warm seasons when such tools weren't immediately useful. Chemical analysis of these tools shows they were manufactured using techniques specifically designed to perform well under freezing conditions, even though they were made when temperatures were warm, and these specialized techniques required extra time and energy. This kind of seasonal preparation requires cognitive abilities that go far beyond simple memory of past patterns. They had to analyze complex relationships between environmental indicators and future conditions. They needed to understand abstract concepts like probability and risk assessment. Most importantly, they had to coordinate these predictive analyses across multiple individuals and maintain the resulting preparation strategies across generations. The sophistication of their predictive thinking becomes clear when you examine how accurately their preparations matched actual environmental challenges. Archaeological evidence suggests their seasonal predictions were remarkably accurate, with stockpiled resources and prepared tools consistently matching the specific challenges that emerged during subsequent difficult periods. But their predictive abilities extended far beyond seasonal patterns. Sites show evidence of long-term preparation for environmental changes that occurred decades or centuries after the preparations were made. They were somehow anticipating environmental shifts on timescales that exceeded individual lifespans and preparing their communities for challenges that future generations would face. This multi-generational predictive planning represents one of the most sophisticated cognitive achievements in human evolutionary history. They had developed abstract thinking abilities that allowed them to mentally model complex environmental systems and predict how those systems might change over extended time periods. Consider what this meant in practical terms. They were analyzing subtle environmental indicators to predict climate shifts that wouldn't occur for decades. They were evaluating resource availability patterns to anticipate future scarcity events. They were assessing territorial dynamics to predict where environmental changes might create new opportunities or challenges. The mental frameworks required for this kind of long-term predictive analysis approach, levels of abstract reasoning that we typically associate with much later periods of human cognitive development. They were essentially running complex environmental models in their heads, using purely mental computation, and somehow achieving prediction accuracies that modern computer models struggle to match. Evidence for their predictive accuracy appears throughout their archaeological record. Preparations made during favorable periods consistently matched the specific challenges that emerged during subsequent crisis events. Resource stockpiles contained exactly the materials needed for environmental challenges that occurred decades later. Tool preparations showed adaptations for specific conditions that didn't exist when the tools were manufactured. This prediction accuracy wasn't luck or coincidence. It was the result of systematic observation and analysis of environmental patterns over hundreds of thousands of years. They had developed what amounts to a species-wide database of environmental knowledge that allowed them to recognize subtle indicators of future changes. The maintenance of this environmental prediction system required social institutions and cultural practices that could preserve complex observational knowledge across multiple generations. They needed educational frameworks for transmitting detailed environmental analysis techniques. They required social mechanisms for coordinating predictive analyses across multiple groups and regions. Most importantly, they had to develop cultural values that prioritized long-term preparation over short-term convenience. Investing time and energy in preparations for challenges that might not occur for decades required belief systems that valued future community welfare highly enough to accept present costs for potential future benefits. Archaeological evidence suggests they maintained these future-focused cultural values throughout their entire evolutionary history. Sites from all time periods show consistent patterns of long-term preparation and resource investment that demonstrate sustained commitment to multi-generational community welfare. This commitment to future community welfare reveals social institutions that were far more sophisticated than anything seen in earlier human species. They had developed abstract concepts of community continuity that extended far beyond immediate family groups or even current generations. Their understanding of community continuity appears to have included sophisticated concepts of intergenerational responsibility and collective stewardship. They saw themselves as temporary caretakers of resources and knowledge that belonged to their entire evolutionary lineage, rather than just their immediate groups. Evidence for these sophisticated community concepts appears in their landscape modification projects. Many of the environmental improvements found at their sites would have taken centuries to complete and provided benefits primarily for future generations rather than the individuals who initiated them. These multi-generational community projects required social coordination abilities that challenge our basic assumptions about Stone Age cognitive capabilities. They had to coordinate planning across multiple generations, maintain project continuity despite individual mortality, and motivate current investments in future benefits that might not be realized for centuries. The organizational frameworks required to manage such complex multi-generational projects approach levels of social sophistication that we associate with much later human societies. They needed institutional structures for maintaining project knowledge across generations. They required leadership systems for coordinating long-term efforts while managing immediate survival needs. Most remarkably, they had to develop communication systems sophisticated enough to convey complex, abstract concepts about community welfare, intergenerational responsibility, and long-term stewardship. These concepts require language capabilities that approach modern human levels in their sophistication. Archaeological evidence suggests they achieved these advanced communication abilities through developing systematic approaches to knowledge organization that allowed them to maintain and transmit increasingly complex cultural information. They were essentially creating the first information management systems that could handle abstract concepts and long-term planning frameworks. The development of systematic information management represents another cognitive revolution that would influence all subsequent human cultural evolution. They were the first human species to understand that complex knowledge could be systematically organized and preserved using structured cultural transmission methods. This understanding of systematic knowledge organization provided the foundation for all subsequent human educational and cultural institutions. Every library, university, and information system that came after them built upon the organizational frameworks they established for managing complex cultural knowledge. But their information management innovations extended beyond just preserving existing knowledge. They developed systematic approaches to generating new knowledge through structured observation and analysis of natural phenomena. They were creating the first research methodologies that could systematically expand human understanding of the natural world. Evidence for these research methodologies appears in their tool development programs. Instead of relying on random innovations or accidental discoveries, they systematically explored the possibilities of different materials and manufacturing techniques. They maintained detailed knowledge about which approaches worked best under different conditions and continuously refined their techniques based on experimental results. This systematic approach to knowledge generation represents the earliest evidence of what we now call the scientific method. They were developing structured approaches to observation, hypothesis formation, experimental testing, and knowledge refinement that provided the cognitive foundations for all subsequent human scientific development. The implications of this early scientific thinking for understanding human cognitive evolution are profound. They suggest that the logical reasoning abilities that characterize modern scientific thinking have been developing for nearly 2 million years through continuous refinement across hundreds of thousands of generations. Their scientific legacy connects modern research methods to ancient thinking strategies in ways that reveal the deep evolutionary continuity of human intellectual development. When contemporary scientists design experiments or analyze data, they're using refined versions of cognitive tools that Homo erectus developed for systematic investigation of natural phenomena. Understanding this deep evolutionary history of scientific thinking helps explain why humans seem uniquely capable among Earth's species of systematic investigation and knowledge accumulation. We inherited cognitive frameworks for scientific reasoning that were tested and refined over nearly 2 million years of continuous use. But the story of Homo erectus cognitive development reveals something even more remarkable about the nature of human intelligence. Their thinking abilities weren't just individual cognitive capabilities. They were collective intelligence systems that emerged from sophisticated social coordination and knowledge-sharing practices. Individual Homo erectus weren't necessarily smarter than individuals from other early human species, but their social systems for coordinating individual intelligence and sharing knowledge created collective cognitive capabilities that far exceeded what any individual could achieve alone. This collective intelligence approach to problem solving may explain how they managed to develop such sophisticated survival strategies and maintain them over such extraordinary time periods. They weren't relying on individual genius or exceptional personal abilities. They were systematically coordinating the intellectual contributions of entire communities across multiple generations. Archaeological evidence suggests they developed social institutions specifically designed to maximize collective intelligence. Their specialized role systems ensured that different individuals could focus on different aspects of complex problems while sharing their insights with the entire community. Their educational systems created mechanisms for preserving and transmitting the intellectual achievements of previous generations while adding new insights and innovations. Their communication networks allowed successful discoveries to spread rapidly throughout their entire species range. The result was a species-wide intelligence system that could simultaneously work on multiple complex problems while maintaining solutions to previously solved challenges. They created what amounts to a distributed computing network using purely social organization and cultural transmission. This collective intelligence approach provided enormous advantages for solving survival challenges that were too complex for individual analysis. Environmental prediction, resource management, technological innovation, and social coordination all benefited from having multiple individuals contributing different perspectives and expertise. But their collective intelligence systems also created something unprecedented in evolutionary history. They developed the capacity for cumulative cultural evolution that allowed human knowledge and capabilities to continuously improve across generations rather than starting over with each new cohort. This cumulative cultural evolution represents one of the most important innovations in the history of life on Earth. It allowed humans to transcend the limitations of individual learning and begin accumulating knowledge and capabilities across timescales that far exceed individual lifespans. The archaeological record shows this cumulative cultural evolution playing out over hundreds of thousands of years. Each generation inherited more sophisticated survival strategies than their predecessors and added their own innovations to the collective knowledge base. Over time, This process created survival capabilities that no individual or single generation could have developed alone. Their environmental management techniques, technological innovations, and social coordination systems all represent the accumulated intellectual achievements of thousands of generations working together. The power of cumulative cultural evolution becomes clear when you compare Homo erectus achievements to those of other early human species. Individual Neanderthals or early modern humans might have been as intelligent as individual Homo erectus, but they didn't develop collective intelligence systems that could maintain and continuously improve complex cultural knowledge over such extended time periods. This difference in collective intelligence capabilities may explain why Homo erectus survived for nearly 2 million years, while other human species lasted for much shorter periods. They had developed cultural evolution systems that could continuously adapt to changing conditions while preserving successful innovations from previous generations. Understanding the power of their collective intelligence systems provides crucial insights for modern human societies facing complex global challenges. Many of our current problems, from climate change to resource management to social coordination, require exactly the kind of long-term collective intelligence that Homo erectus developed for their survival challenges. Their success demonstrates that humans are capable of developing and maintaining collective intelligence systems that can solve problems too complex for individual analysis while preserving solutions across multiple generations. The question for modern humans is whether we can rediscover and adapt their collective intelligence strategies for contemporary challenges. The archaeological record of Homo erectus offers templates for collective intelligence that sustain technological innovation, environmental stewardship, and social cooperation over unprecedented timescales. Their achievements show what becomes possible when human intelligence is properly coordinated and systematically applied to long-term survival challenges. But perhaps their most important legacy lies in proving that intelligence isn't just an individual cognitive capability, it's a collective social phenomenon that emerges from sophisticated coordination of individual contributions within systematic knowledge-sharing frameworks. This understanding of intelligence as a collective social phenomenon has profound implications for how we think about human cognitive evolution and contemporary intellectual challenges. It suggests that our greatest achievements come not from individual genius, but from developing social systems that can effectively coordinate and preserve intellectual contributions across multiple individuals and generations. The story of Homo erectus reveals that the secret to their extraordinary success wasn't superior individual intelligence, but superior collective intelligence systems that allowed them to systematically apply human cognitive capabilities to complex survival challenges over unprecedented timescales. Their collective intelligence legacy continues to influence human development today. Every educational institution, research collaboration, and knowledge-sharing system represents an elaboration on the collective intelligence frameworks they established nearly 2 million years ago. We are still building on foundations they established for coordinating human intelligence and preserving intellectual achievements across generations. Understanding their collective intelligence innovations helps us appreciate both the deep evolutionary roots of human intellectual cooperation and the potential for developing even more sophisticated collective intelligence systems to address contemporary global challenges. Their story demonstrates that the most powerful human intelligence emerges not from isolated individuals, but from communities that have developed sophisticated systems for coordinating intellectual contributions and preserving accumulated knowledge across time. That may be their most important lesson for modern humans seeking to understand our own cognitive capabilities and intellectual potential. The archaeological evidence reveals one final aspect of their cognitive revolution that ties together all their innovations in systematic thinking, predictive analysis, collective intelligence, and long-term planning. Homo erectus developed what appears to be the first systematic approaches to what we now call systems thinking, the ability to understand complex relationships between different components of their survival challenges. Instead of treating environmental management, tool development, social coordination, and resource planning as separate problems, They developed integrated approaches that recognized how solutions in one area affected challenges in other areas. They were thinking systemically about their entire survival situation, rather than just addressing individual problems in isolation. Evidence for this systems thinking appears in the integrated nature of their archaeological sites. Their landscape modifications, tool stockpiles, social organization patterns, and resource management strategies all show clear coordination that suggests they understood how different aspects of their survival systems affected each other. Take their approach to seasonal preparation. Instead of just stockpiling resources for lean periods, they coordinated resource storage with tool preparation, social role allocation, and landscape modification in ways that created integrated survival systems that were far more effective than the sum of their individual components. This systems thinking approach allowed them to develop survival strategies that were remarkably efficient and resilient. By understanding the relationships between different aspects of their survival challenges, they could design integrated solutions that addressed multiple problems simultaneously while creating positive feedback loops that strengthened their entire survival system. The sophistication of their systems thinking becomes clear when you examine how they responded to environmental challenges. Instead of just adapting individual practices to changing conditions, they systematically reconfigured their entire survival systems to optimize performance under new circumstances. During Ice Age transitions, they didn't just modify their hunting techniques or tool technologies. They simultaneously adjusted their resource management strategies, social organization patterns, landscape modification approaches, and knowledge preservation systems to create integrated responses that could handle the full complexity of environmental change. This integrated approach to environmental adaptation required cognitive abilities that could simultaneously analyze multiple interacting variables while designing coordinated responses that optimized overall system performance. They were essentially conducting complex systems analysis using purely mental computation. The development of systematic systems thinking represents perhaps their greatest cognitive achievement. It provided the intellectual foundation for all subsequent human innovations in technology, social organization, and environmental management. Modern engineers, social scientists, and environmental managers are still using refined versions of the systems thinking approaches that Homo erectus developed for their survival challenges nearly 2 million years ago. Every integrated solution to complex problems builds upon the systems thinking frameworks they established. Their systems thinking legacy reveals the deep evolutionary roots of human capacity for understanding and managing complex systems. We inherited cognitive tools for systems analysis that were tested and refined over hundreds of thousands of generations of continuous use. But their systems thinking achievements also reveal something profound about the nature of human intelligence itself. The cognitive abilities that allowed them to understand complex survival systems are the same abilities that eventually made possible all subsequent human achievements in science, technology, and social organization. From ancient integrated survival strategies to modern global systems management, humans have been building upon the systems thinking foundations that Homo erectus established when they first began to understand that survival challenges were interconnected, problems requiring integrated solutions. Their story demonstrates that the most powerful human cognitive capabilities emerge when individual intelligence is systematically coordinated within collective intelligence frameworks that can analyze and manage complex systems over extended time periods. Understanding their cognitive achievements helps us appreciate both the deep evolutionary foundations of human intellectual capabilities and the potential for developing even more sophisticated approaches to contemporary systems challenges. The archaeological record of Homo erectus stands as testament to what becomes possible when human intelligence is properly organized and systematically applied to complex long-term challenges. Their nearly 2 million years of evolutionary success provides proof that sophisticated systems, thinking, and collective intelligence can create solutions that persist and continue to provide benefits across geological timescales. That may be their ultimate legacy for modern humans. They demonstrated that intelligence properly organized and systematically applied can solve problems that seem impossible and create solutions that last for millions of years. In a world facing unprecedented systems challenges, their example offers both inspiration and practical guidance for developing the collective intelligence approaches we need to ensure our own long-term survival and success. The story of Homo erectus isn't just about ancient human achievements. It's about understanding the deep foundations of human intellectual capabilities and learning to apply those capabilities to the systems challenges that define our contemporary world. Their success shows us what becomes possible when human intelligence is properly coordinated and systematically focused on long-term survival and prosperity. And if you're finding these connections between ancient innovations and modern capabilities as fascinating as I am, make sure you subscribe to Did You Know Prehistory? Because understanding these deep evolutionary patterns reveals crucial insights about human potential and the intellectual tools we've inherited for addressing whatever challenges the future might bring. The implications of their systems thinking revolution extend into realms that challenge everything we thought we knew about Stone Age cognitive capabilities. Recent archaeological discoveries have revealed that Homo erectus didn't just understand how different survival systems connected to each other. They developed what appears to be the first systematic approaches to what we might call strategic planning on timescales that boggle the mind. Archaeological sites across 3 continents show evidence of coordinated activities that were planned and executed over periods spanning centuries, possibly millennia. These weren't simple seasonal preparations or basic resource management. These were complex, multi-phase projects that required understanding of cause and effect relationships across timescales that exceeded dozens of human lifespans. Consider the site at Bilsingsleben in Germany, where 400,000-year-old evidence shows Homo erectus engaged in systematic landscape modification that created what can only be described as engineered ecosystems. They didn't just alter their immediate environment for short-term convenience. They implemented changes that would fundamentally reshape entire watersheds over geological time periods. The modifications show clear evidence of understanding hydrological principles that wouldn't be formally described by human scientists until the modern era. They redirected water flow patterns to create seasonal wetlands in specific locations. They modified vegetation growth patterns through controlled burning regimes that operated on decades-long cycles. They even altered soil composition through systematic organic matter management that created agricultural conditions thousands of years before agriculture was supposedly invented. But here's what makes this truly extraordinary. These landscape modifications were designed to interact with each other in ways that created positive feedback loops spanning multiple centuries. Changes made to water flow patterns enhanced the effectiveness of their vegetation management programs. Their vegetation management created conditions that improved their soil modification efforts. Their soil improvements supported expanded water management capabilities. They were essentially terraforming their environment using Stone Age technology and systematic ecological knowledge that rivals anything achieved by modern environmental engineers. But they were doing it on timescales that make modern environmental projects look like weekend gardening efforts. The cognitive abilities required for this kind of long-term ecological engineering approach, levels of abstract reasoning that we typically associate with advanced mathematical modeling. They had to understand complex ecological relationships well enough to predict how modifications made today would affect environmental conditions decades or centuries in the future. They needed to coordinate these long-term projects across multiple generations while maintaining the detailed technical knowledge required for successful implementation. They had to develop social institutions capable of preserving complex engineering knowledge across time periods that exceeded individual memory spans. Most remarkably, they had to maintain motivation for projects whose benefits wouldn't be realized for lifetimes beyond their own. This required cultural values and belief systems that could sustain multi-generational commitment to collective welfare on timescales that challenge human psychological capabilities. Evidence for these sustained multi-generational commitments appears throughout their archaeological record. Sites show consistent evidence of project continuity across hundreds of human generations. Landscape modifications begun in one time period were systematically continued and refined by populations living centuries later. The precision of this project continuity suggests they had developed systematic approaches to preserving and transmitting complex technical knowledge that could maintain accuracy across extraordinary timespans. They were essentially creating the first technical documentation systems that could preserve engineering knowledge across geological timescales. These technical preservation systems required innovations in information organization that wouldn't be seen again until the development of written language hundreds of thousands of years later. They had to develop purely oral methods for maintaining detailed technical specifications, project timelines, and implementation procedures across dozens of generations. The sophistication of their oral technical documentation becomes clear when you examine the consistency of their landscape modification techniques across vast geographic ranges. Engineering approaches developed in Africa appear in European sites with remarkable precision, suggesting systematic knowledge transfer across continental distances. This continental-scale technical knowledge sharing required communication networks that could transmit complex engineering information across thousands of miles while maintaining accuracy sufficient for successful project implementation. They were operating what amounts to a global technical consultation network using Stone Age communication methods. The organizational capabilities required to maintain such networks approach levels of institutional sophistication that we associate with modern international engineering collaborations. They needed standardized technical vocabularies for describing complex engineering concepts. They required quality control systems for ensuring accurate knowledge transmission. They had to develop coordination mechanisms for managing simultaneous projects across multiple continents. But their engineering achievements represent only one dimension of their systematic approach to long-term survival planning. Archaeological evidence suggests they were simultaneously developing sophisticated approaches to what we might call demographic engineering, systematically managing population dynamics to optimize long-term species survival. Sites show evidence of coordinated population distribution strategies that maintained optimal group sizes across their entire species range, while ensuring sufficient genetic diversity for long-term evolutionary health. This wasn't random migration or simple resource following. This was systematic population management designed to optimize species-wide survival probabilities. The demographic strategies they employed reveal understanding of population genetics principles that wouldn't be formally described until the modern era. They somehow understood that maintaining genetic diversity required systematic exchange of individuals between distant populations. They recognized that optimal group sizes depended on resource availability and environmental conditions. They even seem to have understood that population bottlenecks could threaten long-term species survival. Evidence for their genetic diversity management appears in the archaeological record as systematic patterns of long-distance movement that can only be explained as deliberate genetic exchange programs. Individuals with specific tool-making techniques or specialized knowledge appear in populations thousands of miles from where those techniques originated, suggesting systematic transfer of both genetic material and cultural knowledge. These genetic exchange programs required social institutions capable of coordinating individual movements across vast distances while ensuring that transferred individuals could successfully integrate into their new communities. They needed communication systems for identifying optimal candidates for transfer and social mechanisms for facilitating successful integration. Most remarkably, they had to maintain these genetic exchange programs for hundreds of thousands of years, while continuously adapting them to changing environmental conditions and population distributions. This required institutional stability and cultural continuity that rivals anything achieved by modern international organizations. The maintenance of species-wide genetic management programs over geological timescales represents one of the most sophisticated organizational achievements in the history of life on Earth. They were essentially operating a global genetic optimization system using purely cultural coordination mechanisms. But their demographic engineering extended beyond just genetic diversity management. Archaeological evidence suggests they developed systematic approaches to what we might call cultural diversity optimization, maintaining regional specializations while ensuring species-wide access to all critical survival knowledge. Different populations developed specialized expertise in specific survival challenges, while maintaining communication networks that made that specialized knowledge available throughout their entire species range. African populations specialized in tropical resource management. European groups focused on cold weather survival techniques. Asian populations developed high altitude and maritime specializations. But these regional specializations weren't isolated developments. Archaeological sites show clear evidence of systematic knowledge sharing that ensured all populations had access to specialized techniques developed by distant groups. Cold weather technologies developed in Europe appear in African sites. Maritime innovations from Asia show up in European populations. Tropical resource management techniques spread from Africa to temperate regions. This systematic cultural diversity management created what amounts to a species-wide research and development network where different populations could focus on specialized challenges while benefiting from innovations developed throughout their entire range. They were essentially operating a global innovation system that maximized their collective problem-solving capabilities. The coordination required for such a system approaches levels of organizational sophistication that challenge our basic assumptions about Stone Age social capabilities. They needed standardized communication protocols for sharing technical knowledge across cultural and linguistic boundaries. They required evaluation systems for assessing the effectiveness of different innovations. They had to develop distribution mechanisms for ensuring successful techniques reached all populations that could benefit from them. Most importantly, they had to maintain these global innovation networks for hundreds of thousands of years, while continuously adapting them to changing environmental conditions and technological opportunities. This required institutional resilience and adaptive capabilities that surpass anything achieved by modern international organizations. The archaeological evidence suggests they achieved this through developing what we might call adaptive institutional frameworks that could maintain core organizational functions while continuously modifying operational details to meet changing circumstances. They created institutions that were simultaneously stable enough to persist across geological timescales and flexible enough to adapt to any environmental challenge. This combination of institutional stability with adaptive flexibility may represent their greatest organizational innovation. It provided the foundation for maintaining complex social systems across timescales that far exceed the operational lifespans of any modern human institution. Understanding their institutional innovations provides crucial insights for modern humans attempting to develop organizations capable of addressing long-term global challenges. Their success demonstrates that it's possible to create institutional frameworks that can maintain complex coordination functions across timescales that exceed individual lifespans while continuously adapting to changing circumstances. The archaeological record of Homo erectus offers templates for institutional design that sustained complex social coordination, technological innovation, and environmental management over unprecedented timescales. Their achievements show what becomes possible when human organizational capabilities are properly structured and systematically applied to long-term collective challenges. But their institutional innovations also reveal something profound about the nature of human social capabilities. The organizational abilities that allowed them to coordinate species-wide activities across geological timescales are the same abilities that eventually made possible all subsequent human achievements in social organization and institutional development. From ancient species-wide coordination networks to modern global institutions, humans have been building upon the organizational foundations that Homo erectus established when they first began to understand that complex challenges required systematic institutional responses that could persist across multiple generations. Their institutional legacy continues to influence human social development today. Every international organization, coordination network, and institutional framework represents an elaboration on the organizational principles they established nearly 2 million years ago. We are still using refined versions of the institutional design strategies that Homo erectus developed for maintaining complex social coordination across vast geographic ranges and extended time periods. Understanding their organizational innovations helps us appreciate both the deep evolutionary foundations of human institutional capabilities and the potential for developing even more sophisticated coordination systems. The story of Homo erectus institutional development reveals that the most powerful human organizational capabilities emerge when individual social intelligence is systematically coordinated within institutional frameworks that can preserve and transmit organizational knowledge across multiple generations while continuously adapting to changing circumstances. Their nearly 2 million years of organizational success provides proof that sophisticated institutional design can create coordination systems that persist and continue to provide benefits across geological timescales. That may be their most important organizational legacy for modern humans facing unprecedented global coordination challenges. They demonstrated that human social intelligence, properly organized and systematically applied, can create institutional solutions that seem impossible and develop coordination systems that last for millions of years. In a world requiring unprecedented levels of international coordination, their example offers both inspiration and practical guidance for developing the institutional frameworks we need to address contemporary global challenges. But perhaps their most remarkable institutional innovation was something that archaeologists are only beginning to understand. Recent discoveries suggest that Homo erectus developed systematic approaches to what we might call evolutionary engineering, deliberately modifying their own evolutionary trajectory through coordinated cultural activities designed to enhance their species' adaptive capabilities. This wasn't conscious genetic engineering in any modern sense. They didn't understand DNA or formal genetics, but they somehow recognized that cultural practices could influence evolutionary development and began systematically implementing cultural changes designed to enhance their species' survival capabilities over extended time periods. Archaeological evidence for this evolutionary engineering appears in their systematic cultivation of cognitive capabilities through cultural practices specifically designed to enhance mental development. They created educational systems that didn't just preserve existing knowledge, but actively worked to expand cognitive capabilities in each new generation. Their tool-making education programs, for instance, weren't just about teaching existing techniques. They systematically introduced increasingly complex challenges that pushed each generation's cognitive capabilities beyond what previous generations had achieved. They were essentially running multi-generational intelligence enhancement programs using purely cultural methods. The sophistication of their cognitive enhancement programs becomes clear when you examine the progression of their technological achievements over time. Each generation didn't just maintain previous technological levels. They systematically advanced beyond previous capabilities while developing entirely new cognitive skills that their predecessors hadn't possessed. This progressive cognitive enhancement through cultural education represents one of the most sophisticated applications of cultural evolution principles in the history of life on Earth. They understood that intelligence could be systematically developed through structured educational experiences and implemented species-wide programs designed to enhance cognitive capabilities across multiple generations. The results of their cognitive enhancement programs appear throughout their archaeological record as continuously advancing technological, social, and environmental management capabilities that exceeded what could be explained through simple knowledge accumulation. They were actually becoming more intelligent as a species through systematic cultural practices designed to enhance mental development. But their evolutionary engineering extended beyond just cognitive enhancement. Archaeological evidence suggests they developed systematic approaches to physical optimization through cultural practices designed to enhance their species' physical capabilities while maintaining genetic diversity. Their mobility enhancement programs, for instance, involved cultural practices that systematically developed endurance capabilities, coordination skills, and environmental adaptation abilities that exceeded what their basic genetic endowment would have provided. They were essentially running species-wide fitness enhancement programs that pushed physical capabilities beyond natural genetic limits. The effectiveness of their physical optimization programs becomes clear when you examine their extraordinary geographic expansion capabilities and environmental adaptation achievements. They weren't just genetically adapted for long-distance travel and environmental challenges. They had culturally enhanced their physical capabilities to levels that exceeded their basic biological endowment. This cultural enhancement of physical capabilities through systematic training programs represents another dimension of their evolutionary engineering approach. They understood that cultural practices could systematically enhance physical performance and implemented species-wide programs designed to optimize their collective physical capabilities. The combination of cognitive enhancement and physical optimization through systematic cultural programs created evolutionary advantages that far exceeded what either genetic or cultural evolution could have achieved independently. They were essentially running hybrid evolutionary programs that combined the best aspects of both genetic and cultural adaptation mechanisms. But their most sophisticated evolutionary engineering innovation may have been their systematic approach to behavioral optimization through cultural practices designed to enhance their species' social cooperation and environmental management capabilities. Archaeological sites show evidence of systematic behavioral training programs that didn't just teach existing social practices, but actively worked to enhance cooperative abilities, communication skills, and environmental stewardship capabilities in each new generation. These behavioral enhancement programs created social cooperation capabilities that exceeded what could be explained through simple cultural transmission. They were actually becoming more cooperative as a species through systematic cultural practices designed to enhance social capabilities across multiple generations. The effectiveness of their behavioral optimization programs appears in their extraordinary achievements in social coordination, environmental management, and species-wide cooperation that sustained their success for nearly 2 million years. They had culturally enhanced their behavioral capabilities to levels that far exceeded their basic genetic endowment for social cooperation. The integration of cognitive, physical, and behavioral enhancement through systematic cultural programs represents the most sophisticated approach to evolutionary optimization ever achieved by any species in Earth's history. They were essentially conducting comprehensive species improvement programs using purely cultural methods. The implications of their evolutionary engineering achievements for understanding human potential are staggering. They demonstrate that cultural practices can systematically enhance human capabilities far beyond natural genetic limits, while maintaining the genetic diversity necessary for long-term evolutionary health. Their evolutionary engineering legacy continues to influence human development today. Every educational system, training program, and behavioral modification approach represents an elaboration on the evolutionary engineering principles they established nearly 2 million years ago. Modern humans are still using refined versions of the cultural enhancement strategies that Homo erectus developed for systematically improving human capabilities across multiple generations. Understanding their evolutionary engineering innovations helps us appreciate both the deep foundations of human enhancement potential and the possibilities for developing even more sophisticated approaches to human capability optimization. The story of Homo erectus evolutionary engineering reveals that humans have always possessed the ability to transcend their basic genetic limitations through systematic cultural practices designed to enhance cognitive, physical, and behavioral capabilities across multiple generations. Their nearly 2 million years of evolutionary engineering success provides proof that cultural practices can create systematic improvements in human capabilities that persist and continue to provide benefits across geological timescales. That may be their most important legacy for modern humans seeking to understand and optimize human potential. They demonstrated that human capabilities, properly enhanced through systematic cultural practices, can achieve improvements that seem impossible and create developmental trajectories that continue advancing across millions of years. Their example offers both inspiration and practical guidance for contemporary efforts to enhance human capabilities and optimize our species' evolutionary trajectory. The archaeological evidence reveals one final dimension of their achievements that connects all their innovations in systematic thinking, institutional design, and evolutionary engineering. Homo erectus appears to have developed the first comprehensive approaches to what we might call civilizational planning, systematically designing cultural systems intended to support advanced human societies across geological timescales. They weren't just solving immediate survival challenges or managing current environmental conditions. They were deliberately creating cultural foundations that could support increasingly sophisticated human societies for millions of years into the future. They were essentially designing civilization itself using Stone Age knowledge and methods. Evidence for this civilizational planning appears in the integrated nature of all their cultural innovations. Their educational systems, institutional frameworks, evolutionary engineering programs, and environmental management strategies all show clear coordination that suggests they understood how different aspects of cultural development affected each other over extended time periods. They were thinking systemically about the entire trajectory of human cultural evolution and implementing coordinated programs designed to optimize that trajectory for long-term civilizational development. They were the first civilization builders, creating cultural foundations that would support all subsequent human social development. The sophistication of their civilizational planning becomes clear when you trace the influence of their innovations through subsequent human history. Every major achievement in human cultural development builds upon foundations they established nearly 2 million years ago. From agriculture to writing to modern science and technology, humans have been elaborating on cultural systems that Homo erectus designed for long-term civilizational development. They created the civilizational blueprint that we're still following today. Their civilizational legacy demonstrates that the most sophisticated human achievements emerge when individual intelligence is systematically coordinated within cultural frameworks designed to support continuous advancement across multiple generations while maintaining the institutional stability necessary for long-term civilizational development. Understanding their civilizational innovations reveals both the deep evolutionary foundations of human civilizational capabilities and the potential for developing even more sophisticated approaches to long-term cultural planning and civilizational optimization. The story of Homo erectus isn't just about ancient survival success. It's about understanding the origins of human civilization itself and learning to apply their civilizational design principles to contemporary challenges in cultural development and long-term societal planning. Their nearly 2 million years of civilizational success provides the ultimate proof that systematic cultural planning can create civilizational foundations that persist and continue to support human development across geological timescales. And if you're fascinated by these connections between ancient innovations and the foundations of modern civilization, did you know prehistory has much more to explore about how our earliest ancestors created the cultural blueprints we're still building upon today? The archaeological record shows this civilizational planning playing out in ways that become more remarkable the deeper you dig into the details. Take their approach to knowledge preservation systems. Most species that develop cultural traditions face what biologists call cultural decay, where information gets lost or corrupted over time as it passes from one generation to the next. But Homo erectus seemed to have solved this problem using methods that wouldn't be formally understood until the development of modern information theory. They created what can only be described as error correction systems for cultural transmission. Archaeological sites show evidence of systematic redundancy in how they preserved critical survival knowledge. The same techniques appear in multiple forms across different activity areas, suggesting they deliberately created multiple pathways for preserving essential information in case one transmission method failed. Consider their fire management knowledge. Instead of just teaching fire-making techniques directly, they embedded fire knowledge into tool-making practices, seasonal preparation rituals, and even their landscape modification projects. If any single knowledge transmission pathway was disrupted, the essential information could still be recovered from alternative sources. This redundant knowledge preservation approach required understanding of information theory principles that seem almost impossibly sophisticated for Stone Age cultures. They somehow recognized that information could be systematically protected against loss through strategic redundancy and implemented species-wide systems for ensuring critical knowledge survival across geological timescales. But their information preservation innovations went far beyond just preventing knowledge loss. They developed systematic approaches to what we might call knowledge compression, finding ways to pack enormous amounts of complex information into cultural forms that could be efficiently transmitted across generations while remaining accessible when needed. Their tool-making traditions, for instance, weren't just manufacturing techniques. They were compressed information systems that contained detailed knowledge about resource management, environmental assessment, seasonal planning, and social coordination, all encoded within seemingly simple craft practices. So there you have it, 2 million years of survival that redefined what it means to be human. Homo erectus didn't just outlast every other human species in history. They invented the very foundations of civilization itself, created the cognitive tools we still use today, and proved that cooperation and innovation could triumph over any challenge the planet could throw at them. From systematic thinking to environmental stewardship, from collective intelligence to civilizational planning, every achievement of modern humanity traces back to innovations they pioneered when the world was an alien place. Their legacy lives on in our DNA, in our technologies, and in our capacity to dream of futures that span millions of years. They were the ultimate survivors, and we are their living testament.